Okay. Okay, so the gain is good. Okay, let's get this started. This video, kind of. Uh-oh. God damn it. So, despite my rather lighthearted introduction, I want to stress that this video, for all intents and purposes, is actually a pretty serious video, in all things considered. And I want to essentially say, in short, that AniTube has kind of a methodology problem. Or, I guess, broadly more speaking, kind of a problem in general. And I'm going to be using three general references to situate this. I'm not going to be talking about their videos directly. I'm not going to be talking about their videos in depth. Essentially, I think AniTube has sort of a challenge or hurdle it has to overcome regarding kind of questionable research when it comes to Isekai. Now, of course, on some level, people might say, well, Joe, you yourself might not necessarily be the best source. And I'm not going to say I'm going to be the best source in this case. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline one of the major problems that I think that we have to kind of deal with. Now, when I'm talking about AniTube, I'm talking about three general anime YouTube channels that I think are really relevant in this context. The first one is Manime Matt. The second one is Gigguk. And the third one is Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll released a Isekai video that's pretty bad. If you know those AniTubers, please send this video to them, because I don't really think that they're going to watch my content regardless. I don't know. Who knows? We'll see. So let's say we want to talk about Isekai, right? Like, what do we do? What do we talk about? What do we mean? Etc., etc., etc. One of the problems we're having here is that when we say Isekai, what does Isekai mean? We fall into this trap. And what I mean by that is we fall into a prescriptive trap. So when we're talking about definitions, one of the big things that we have to consider is that when we're dealing with definitions, there's two big ways to look at it, right? We have a prescriptive definition, and then we have a descriptive definition. Now, a prescriptive definition is a definition that is determined on the basis of a model that we set out that defines the conditions of that thing we're talking about. So, for example, if somebody says, mammals are warm-blooded animals. Mammals are warm-blooded animals that give birth to live young. So, to be fair, I don't really know if that's entirely the case. But, as an example, if something doesn't fulfill the conditions of that, then it's not a mammal. Simple as that. That's how we know something is or is not a mammal. So, on the other hand, we have a descriptive definition. A descriptive definition is a definition of something that we use to describe a series of things that kind of stand out, and we might be able to understand them as being distinct or different from something, but we aren't necessarily sure entirely exactly what we mean, what are the conditions, what are the boundaries. And oftentimes, at the boundaries, they can be incredibly porous. They can be incredibly nebulous. And as a result, it can be a little bit difficult to come to a prescriptive model about things that we have thus described. And that's why a lot of people might default to a descriptive definition of something. And I think Isekai, in this context, in the context of anime YouTubers, because I don't know what it's going to be like outside of anime YouTubers, I'm not going to talk about that. But in the context of anime YouTubers, we're falling into this trap in which we're taking a prescriptive definition and we're running with it, when in reality, I think more productively, we got to look at it in terms of a descriptive definition. We got to look at it descriptively. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you sit somebody down and say, well, what is Isekai? They immediately and intuitively say, well, it's otherworld stories. And here is the problem. Because what ends up happening here is that people say, well, it's otherworld stories, and then they just run with it. Because they don't really think about it. They just kind of run with the definition and say, well, okay, otherworld stories. What are the otherworld stories that are relevant in this situation? You got Spirited Away, Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland. You have fucking Crunchyroll using Urashima Taro. Like, oh, Harry Potter might be seen as a kind of isekai. Like, what is that? What is this? And so here's the problem, right? When you run with something on the basis of it as that thing, simply based upon this definition you've set out, now all of a sudden, if you believe that something fulfills those conditions, and just those conditions, and that necessitates it as that, then all of a sudden you have to start to deal with, well, what are the things that can be interpreted as that, or what are the things that can be thought of as that, but all of a sudden they have very different politics, very different lineages, very different influences, very different conditions. How do you account for that? Here's the problem, because if you now run with that definition, you have to account for the things that kind of don't really make that much of a sense, but nevertheless, they fulfill the conditions that you've now set down. For example, let's say somebody says, well, Star Wars, Star Wars is about Luke Skywalker, who's on Tatooine, and one day he is thrust into the situation where he now leaves his planet and then goes to other worlds. Well, is that now Isekai? By the basic definition that we've outlined, if you want to be really cheeky about it, okay, yeah, sure. Well, all of a sudden now it's Isekai. But here's the problem, right? That doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's not very productive in regards to the discussion that's being had here. Unless you want to be able to make the connection that somehow Star Wars and what we know as Isekai in anime and manga are connected through some particular thread, then where does that lead us? It leads us nowhere, except for one incredibly problematic and troublesome line of thought. And that is the idea that Isekai used to be something, that it used to be good, that it used to be interesting, that it used to be these sorts of things. This is something that I see in Twitter threads a lot, when people say, well, Spirited Away was an example of a good Isekai. Or Alice in Wonderland is an example of a good Isekai. Or when you have all of these other material and you have all of these other texts say, these used to be good Isekai, and the Isekai we have now are bad ones. I've seen these comments before, and this is a big problem because now essentially we're exercising a very specific and questionable way of understanding these particular ideas and these particular stories, and we're applying them in a specific way that might not necessarily be a really good apples to oranges. That might not necessarily be a really good apple-to-apple comparison. Apples to apple? That might not necessarily be a really good apples-to-apples comparison, and that's the problem. So the easiest way to think about this, and we're talking about Isekai, is in regards to Ikehara Hitoshi. Side note, one of the things I have to mention about the name is that I'm really bad at reading Japanese names, so please, for the love of God, please do not get on my kids for misreading the name. If you know exactly how the name's supposed to be read, let me know. So there's this article, it's a kind of an incomplete article, but it's actually really interesting because one of the things it talks about is called the semantic shift of Ikai stories. So what do I mean by that? Well, Ikai stories are stories that are folkloric, they're supernatural stories, they're about going into otherworld places, but they're otherworld places that sort of have a sort of spiritual extension to the world in which they're already there. So in this case, we have something like Spirited Away, or My Neighbor Totoro, or we have, for instance, Yu Yu Hakusho. Yu Yu Hakusho, in a lot of instances, we might say is Isekai. He saves a kid, he gets hit by a car, and then all of a sudden he's now in this other place. But we don't think about it like that. We don't. You don't really see a lot of people saying, well, this is Isekai until now this boom is sort of happening. So what's going on? Well, the answer is because we've already kind of had an idea for that. And it's sort of this idea of the Ikai story, otherworldly stories. And this distinction is really important because now we have this distinction between Ikai and Isekai. Now, to be fair, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're entirely separate from each other. Nor am I saying that they should be entirely separate, because Ikehara admits that, on some level, it's kind of a bit of a challenge as well. But here's the thing. When we're talking about Isekai, what is Isekai as we understand as Isekai? If we're going to approach this descriptively, right? If we're going to be doing it this particular way, how do we actually think about it? I think Isekai in this context can be largely traced back to urban planning. And so what I'm focusing on in this case is probably a little bit closer to Keiichiro Morikawa's discussion on Akihabara in the early 2000s, where he's talking about it in the context of the Personaopolis. So what do I mean by that? Keiichiro Morikawa is talking about Tokyo's spaces, and there are two particular spaces he focuses on. He focuses on, boom, Shibuya, and then the other one he focuses on is, without question, Akihabara. Now, Akihabara is actually really important in this context, but we're going to focus on Shibuya first. So Shibuya, he describes, is a place of glass. It's a place where people look into, people reflect, people show off. People are these sorts of visible relationships in a sort of very Lacanian kind of way, right? On the other hand, we have Akihabara. Now, Akihabara is a little bit different because Akihabara is a place emblazoned with these sorts of advertisements that cover, that people are going there to enter into the buildings. Now, here's a really interesting part. Whereas Morikawa talks about Shibuya in the context of glass, in which we look through and see the mannequins or the clothing or the people and so on and so forth. In Akihabara, the windows are obfuscated. They're kept covered by advertisements. And so the idea here is that when you enter these buildings to go into the maid cafes or somewhat, you are essentially entering into another world. That's the word he's using, isekai. And so why is this important? Because if we're looking at earlier isekai in the context that we think about it as modern day isekai today, well, one of the interesting ones is Log Horizon. When they're sent to this other world, well, where do they show up? Well, it's a desiccated corpse of Akihabara. But it's not Akihabara, right? It's a hyper-real Akihabara, because it's not really Akihabara. It's simply just a space that mimics it. And so as a result, there's a lot of very important connections that we can now make as a result of that implication by talking. So here's the challenge, right? Because if we had really looked at it in the broad context of, well, it's isekai because it's about an otherworld story, then the problem here is that it extends it so far, and so wide, it doesn't help us. By that metric, then pretty much any katabatic tale, which is, tales of descent and tales of descent and movement, so on and so forth. Any katabatic kind of tale would fulfill that. The story of Izanagi descending into Yomi to retrieve his bride is itself a sort of sent into another place. So, this is a really problematic element. This is a really troublesome element. And the problem here is that you have channels like Manime Matt and Gigguk and Crunchyroll, they don't actually care about this. They don't care about these distinctions. And so as a result, we have these incredibly loose usages of the term. And they're not loose simply because they're porous. They are porous. But the problem here is that they don't actually tell us a lot of things. They don't reveal a lot of things. And this is the problem. This is the fundamental problem. If we're talking about isekai then, how do we actually talk about it? This is actually even further problematized by the fact that Crunchyroll's video has zero mention about isekai in regards to Shousetsuka ni Naro. So Shousetsuka ni Naro, as Damien and I have already talked about in the videos, is a website. It's a website upon which anybody can write stories, and then they can post those stories, and then how the website works actually informs a lot of the way in which people write these kinds of stories. I've been doing a lot of I don't really know if you would call it digital ethnography, because that seems a little condescending to the people there, but I've been a part of the I guess you can call it that corner of shousetsu for a while, and so I'm very familiar with how it works and how people kind of interact with each other and so on and so forth. When we're talking about isekai, there's a lot of elements about isekai that are very disparate. People might say, for instance, the Naro image, the Naroke, the idea of strong characters, or the incompetently strong characters, la ore tue, the really I'm strong sort of K kind of stuff. Or we might also think about it in the context of Muso-ke, these sorts of stories which are based off games, which are these characters who are incredibly strong, but they just mow down waves and waves of mooks. If you think about it in the context of Overlord, for instance, the third season, when he unleashes the spell and so on and so forth. So you have all of these sorts of things, right? Those are elements that can be part of isekai, but they don't actually have to be part of isekai. For instance, we can look at something like, say, Berserk of Gluttony, or Tatoeba Last Dungeon. Those stories have a lot of elements that kind of share with isekai, but they're not isekai. So now here comes the question, what about isekai, on the basis of it as isekai, actually makes it worth distinguishing? This is where research is really interesting. This is a really interesting space to look at. Because if we say, though, isekai shares these elements with these other things, then we could reasonably argue that it's not isekai on the basis of it being isekai that makes it that. In fact, it's more so that isekai shares a publishing space with these particular kinds of stories. And as a result, it's more of a Venn diagram. They share these elements. That's why you might have something like Nozumanu Fushibokensha doesn't actually have an isekai setting, and yet, nevertheless, it has a lot of things it shares with isekai. Here's the fundamental problem, right? So few of these anime YouTubers, they actually care about this. The only thing that they care about is actually talking about isekai. And I want to believe on some level, they're doing it because they actually are trying to understand it. But they're not really going to they're not going through that much effort to actually try and understand it. You're essentially taking these larger moving parts and you're essentially saying, well, the only thing that represents it is the only thing that I see. That's kind of the problem I'm having right now. And so this is a hard cut. This is hard cut because I don't really know how to proceed after that part here, after that little bit of a rant. But now here's the question, right? Okay, let's move the shosetsu stuff out. Let's go back to the question. What about isekai on the basis of it as isekai? Might be interesting to look at. Well, when you look at it this way, the relationship is actually really interesting because now we can actually look at the components of how they operate. That's why it's important to understand things like tensei, reincarnation, tenni, transference, shokan, summoning, because they can actually inform us about the sort of reasoning behind a lot of these and glean at a kind of underlying political thought process that's incurred in these sorts of stories. You might look at tensei and notice that because they're death, they actually tend to represent death in very specific ways, aside from the whole funny truck meme, right? We also have to consider that a lot of the more grimy isekai oftentimes are tensei. They've been killed by somebody, oftentimes a family member. They've been killed over debts, or they've been attacked, or they've died from overworking, and so on and so forth. Or they might sort of see it as a rehabilitative sense. Isekai Yakyoku is one example of a tensei that as a result of the main character dying from overwork. Or when we look at, for example, tenni isekai are really interesting because they can constantly move back and forth between spaces. They oftentimes can bring ideas and resources in a way that a lot of other isekai types don't. And as a result, it can be a sort of modernistic fetishes. That's why a lot of food isekai are tenni. They can constantly jump back and forth between Japan and the other world because they can bring resources from Japan over. Gate, for instance, which allows them to sort of move back and forth between the gate and allness. And then you have shokan. Shokan is the fundamental, quintessential call to action, but they also tend to be the ones that are the most gamey because they're ultimately distinct call to actions that are played on these sort of Dragon Quest or their Dragon Quest and Chrono Trigger sort of images. They've now thus been summoned, sort of like you're starting a game, and then now you get to choose what you want to do, because the goal now is to defeat the Demon King. But a lot of them oftentimes do buck the call to action, and it sort of gives us a little bit of an insight into how people sort of think about whether they actually accept or reject that call to action, and what that necessarily entails. So these are the ways in which we can actually think about them, right? These sorts of isekai stories, what they mean, what they might imply, on the basis of them as actually isekai. And not just simply as an extension of the giant shosetsu arm, which I really need to stress that a lot of anime YouTubers just don't care about. This is a problem. This is a fundamental problem. And then perhaps on some level you might say, well, Joe, you only care about this because this is the community that you care about. Okay, sure, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We're so ready and so willing to believe that this media mix system just has absolutely no bearing upon the way in which these stories are read, the way in which they're interpreted, the way in which they're produced. I've talked about this before, but from my position, I think that we really have to sort of disengage yourself from this belief that these stories exist in a sort of beautiful bubble all on their own that can simply be read as simply just that. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's really a tenable argument to be made here in this sort of position. I've made this mention before, and I've talked about this before. Shosetsu, as a space, has a very distinct social media relationship in which what it does, it actively tries to get you to know what other people are doing, to see how their stories are doing, to know how your stories are doing, and to know how people are responding to your works. That's a really important thing, because now you are incentivized to try and better your work, because now you're trying to better your work, but not in the context of a sort of immutable, perennial sort of idea about writing, but rather how other people are doing it. And thus you have this tendency to adapt and adopt and sort of move on in. Now you have a tendency to adapt and adopt and sort of move on in this particular fashion. And that's a really important distinction that really has to be made that a lot of people are not making. We really can't be comfortable with this kind of shoddy research that's being played around here in AniTube. I really have to stress this. You have people out there talking about the medium is the message, the medium is the message, the medium is the message, like it's some sort of godforsaken meme. You have people out there talking about it, but they don't think about it. They don't think about what that actually means. They go around and they cite Marshall McLuhan and go, oh yeah, the medium is the message, the way in which something is told is important, so on and so forth. But they don't actually think about the network in which all of these media are beginning to operate. Because, boom, the moment they come across one particular story that sure rubs against their idea of aesthetics or narrative, then all of a sudden they go off and then they say, well, this story is bad. And then you say, well, what about these sort of pressures that these stories have to deal with when they're being written or understood? And then they don't care. Be consistent. If you're going to say the medium is the message, then try and understand exactly how the medium affects the message. How the message is the medium. It's absurd. And I don't like the way that it's normalized. I don't like the way that this thing is natural. When I reached out to Kanekiro Kogitsune, the author of V-Monster, I told him, my name is Joe, I'm a YouTuber, I'm studying Isekai. My research project is about Isekai. I'm wondering if I can ask you a few questions. He says to me, the question, researching Isekai was kind of interesting. By his own admission, not a lot of people ask him about that. It's crazy. One of the biggest, he's huge on Shosetsu. Remonster isn't some sort of small, rinky-dinky story that nobody cares about. It's big on Shosetsu. It's pretty notable in terms of the isekai kinds of stories it sort of hangs out in. The very fact that this author, this well-known author, who, I should mind you, has quite a number of volumes published, has a manga adaptation, who's been working on these sorts of stories since 2011, who has a game adaptation, the fact that he responds to me by saying that he really doesn't get a lot of these kinds of questions is really fascinating. And it's kind of depressing because we sit here and we speculate and talk about these sorts of stories. And yet, at the same time, we completely are comfortable with this erasure of these people. We're completely comfortable with this erasure of the system here that's in play. And I don't understand it. I don't understand why we're so comfortable with this. It has nothing to do with whether people think, oh, isekai is a genre not worth studying, or isekai is a genre or a type that's just like, oh, it just makes shitty stories. I don't care. It doesn't matter. To be entirely honest, there's a part of me, right? There's a part of me where I'm constantly paranoid. I'm constantly paranoid that I'm going to get something wrong. I'm going to misread something. I'm going to misinterpret something. I'm always paranoid that everything I'm doing is wrong, that there's some part of me that the fridge is started. But there's a part of me where I sit down and I say, I'm going to make another video. These are my thoughts. This is what I want to talk about. These are the things I want to talk about. This is the way I want to talk about it. And I'm always paranoid. I'm always paranoid that at some level, what I'm saying, what I'm doing, it just doesn't matter, right? Because I'm going to get something so fundamentally incorrect. And all this time you sit and you read and you try and talk to people, you send out all these emails, you ask people, what are their thoughts and so on and so forth. And you check, you double check, you triple check, and then you put it up. And then you have to deal with such ridiculous. And then you have to deal with 2-3 sentences of somebody saying, well, what do you think about Crunchyroll's take upon this? And then then you go off and you say, okay, well, maybe they have something really interesting that I've never thought about, because Crunchyroll is a company with resources. Crunchyroll is a company with translators who are working all around the clock, who have a lot of familiarity. They have connections. They have all of these sorts of things. I thought, oh, maybe, they're going to have some sort of insight that I've just never, ever thought about. And you know what? Maybe sometimes they do. I thought that for all of the issues that I had with that Isekai video that they sent out, I thought there were a few things in that video that were great. But then it's just the rest of it is just, I don't understand. I don't understand these connections that are being made. I don't understand how they work. And I don't understand why none of these anti-tubers, and I know that a lot of people are going to say, oh, this is just a funny meme. This is a hilarious meme. Another hilarious meme from Joe. You know. But no, I don't understand why so many of these anti-tubers just don't cite their work. I don't get it. How can this community move forward as sort of any intellectual space if it doesn't even do the very basic of intellectual honesty? If it doesn't commit to the very basic of intellectual honesty, are we so comfortable with simply just being a part of this sort of intellectual gutter? Are we? I came from the live reaction community. That's where I came from. I came from the live reaction community, and I started to change my content. Not because I thought it would get hits, not because I thought it would make my channel big. No, I came from the live reaction community because I wanted to see a specific kind of content, and I just was not seeing it. So I started making it. And then I started realizing that, for some reason, it's just not a practice for people to do specific things. And here's the thing, right? There are a lot of good anti-tubers out there who do cite their sources, who do try their best to sort of make these sorts of strides to put out the content that they want to put out in the best way that they can. You've got Kamimashita, you've got Beyond Ghibli, you've got Zeria, you've got all of these people who are at least trying. And yet on the other side, we have these people who are comfortable, so comfortable with this opaqueness. When they say research done by such and such, well, it's just like, I don't care. I'm not going to take your... I apologize to everybody. This is a one-time thing. This will not happen again. I'm very sorry. I know you are... Everybody signs up to the channel not because they want to see me rant against the world into the abyss. But I'm very sorry. I'm very, very sorry. But I think it has to be done. I don't know. I don't know. I'll link the Shosetsu video I've talked about that was on my second channel. There's so much. There's just so much that's interesting about this field that we can talk about. There's so much interesting about this topic that we can talk about. And I can't do this alone. And you know what? I think there are people in this community who might have really interesting things to say about it. But if we're going to be okay with such a lazy foundation, then I don't know. I'll be back to my good normal self. I'll be back to my normal wordy self. And hopefully that goes a little bit better. I really hope that I don't I really want to stress that I really hope I don't shy anybody away from this. I'm usually not like this. I'm very sorry.